Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Kristen Berman is co-founder, along with Dan Ariely, of Irrational Labs, a behavioral product design company. Irrational Labs helps companies and nonprofits understand and leverage behavioral economics and behavioral science to increase the health, wealth, and happiness of their users. She also co-founded Common Sense Lab, a similar initiative dedicated to improving the financial well-being for low to middle-class Americans. Kristen's work has been featured in the Stanford Innovation Review, TechCrunch, and Scientific American. She was on the founding team for the Behavioral Economics Group at Google, a group that touches over 26 teams across Google, and she hosted one of the top behavioral change conferences globally, StartupOnomics. Make sure I get that right. She co-authored a series of workbooks called Hacking Human Nature for Good, a practical guide to changing behavior, with Dan Ariely again. These workbooks are being used at companies like Google, Intuit, Netflix, Fidelity, Lending Club, all for business strategy and design work. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. I'm going to send that bio to my mom. She'll be very proud. I'm hearing all that together and I'm overwhelmed.
The guests who I have on the show, like yourself, deserve these very long introductions and bios, and I read them and I'm just so impressed every time. So yes, please do send to your mom. So I was thinking what I wanted to kick off and start our conversation with. I'm super excited to have you on to talk specifically about product. So far, the folks I've spoken with, some of it related to product, but mostly sort of more strategic and big and on the policy side. So here in our chat today, I'm hoping to get into the little bit of the weeds with product design. And so I was thinking maybe I'll keep it easy and just ask you a question like, oh, how did you get into this work? And then I figure I'd make it hard for you. So I apologize for that, but I think I would just want to dive right into it, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So what really stood out, as I've been following your work, is this notion of what some people are calling behavior change for good. And what I love you use here is, the happy, healthy, and wise. Sorry, happy, not wealthy. Happy, healthy, and sorry, what is it? I'm now mixing up.
Happy, healthy, and wealthy. And you can
happy. Yes.
Yeah, you can really put those in any order and it sounds good. But we do focus on helping people be happier, healthier, and wealthier.
Gotcha. And I know now the whole Freudian slip that I just messed up completely is because it's a nice amendment to the old proverb, which I think some people liken to or ascribe to Benjamin Franklin, but it was maybe some other old guy in the 1600s. But I really like that. It sounds nice. And so I'm struck by it. Because I do want that. And I think most behavioral practitioners want that because we're a good bunch. But it seems as of late, in the last decade or so, that with big tech and digital revolution, that it seems like a lot of our products are making us, should I say, sad, fat, and poor. Mm-hmm. And I know we've addressed this in our field, and a lot of it has to do with the so-called intention-action gap. Which we can definitely get to. So I guess what I'm curious about, and definitely to hear your insights, is I wonder, is it the product designers and these tech geniuses, especially coming from Silicon Valley, those who are behind the scenes, are they creating these products which just so happen to steer us off track to make us sad, fat, and poor instead of happy, healthy, and wealthy? Or is it, to be a little bit more cynical, is it more of a sinister scheming by some of these giants in Silicon Valley, such that they know that the things that make us sad, fat, and poor are excess consumption of social media, excess consumption of fast food, burgers, because it's those things which contribute directly to their bottom line and to their success. So all of that long-winded preamble, I'm curious, where do you think behavioral scientists, behavioral economists, behavioral design folks fit into this? And how can we make sure that moving forward, we are designing for behavior change for good?
Yeah, great meaty question to start. So I don't think behavioral science offers as much as we think it does to the folks who are, trying to capture our attention and increase our waistlines. One of my first workshops I did was early on was for an advertising company that was trying to do some advertising for good, and we did the normal presentation. This is probably now close to 10 years ago that we were doing at that time, or Dan was preaching as well, and they just kind of looked and said, "This is just not that interesting. We already know about norms, and we know about loss aversion, and we know these things." So I don't think the field has too much to teach folks who are already succeeding, and they're succeeding because they understand human biases and irrationality, and they've understood how to hack them for a very long time. Whether it be used car salesmen or casinos, right? This is nothing new. The field of behavioral science is tackling much harder problems, which is trying to get people to do things that they want to do in the future, but are very difficult for us to do in the short term. And this is things like save money, where it's, we all want to be rich in the future, and yet, we buy things we may not need as much, or take on debt that's a little too expensive. And so the problem actually really comes in behavioral science is trying to actually get practitioners and industry folks to adopt some of these tactics that have been learned by the folks that are manipulating our attention, and use them to position some of the things they're selling for good. And I think there's a discussion there, because in some ways we could say, but isn't there another way? Do we really need to go to these tactics? And I think this is probably just ignorant of human biases. If we said, well, that assumes basically we can change our biases. And I think, I think Kahneman actually just recently said he has no hope that humans can really that we can change our natural biases. And if that's the case, then we actually have to fight the good fight with what we do have as the capacity of humans. And that means maybe reframing savings to be more present. We understand that we're present bias, and so savings is never going to be sexy. And in order to get Americans to save, we either have to make it drop dead simple, or we have to make it somehow appealing. On came the rise of prize-linked savings, which is like trying to get people to save because it's like gambling. So I think the field of behavioral science is tackling a much harder problem, and sadly using some of the same, not sadly, just this is how it goes, is using a lot of the same tactics that have been known for a very long time. So that's kind of one answer. The second is I don't believe people in these companies are manipulative. And I think this is somewhat of a controversial point of view, and maybe I'm biased because I'm actually based in San Francisco and Silicon Valley around these tech companies. I just don't think they're manipulative. I think what we're doing as an industry, and this is not just tech, but is measuring the wrong things, right? So we're measuring logins, we're measuring engagement, we're measuring profit and revenue, which is not terrible, but we're forgetting to measure customer well-being. We're forgetting to measure increases in saving of time or saving of money, things that would increase someone's well-being. And so you put any human in this environment, and they are, we are what we measure. And so if I'm going to reward you for hitting a metric, we will run towards that metric. And so I don't think that it's, that these people are bad people. It's just that we're incentivizing, and maybe this is just capitalism, and I'm just calling out capitalism, but we're incentivizing folks with only metrics that we should kind of look at this and say, no, that this is happening, because look at how we're incentivizing people to build products and services.
Mm-hmm. Now, to that point of, incentivizing, or at least having our KPIs and our measurements that are things like satisfaction and well-being, sort of these more wellness-based measures. Do we see that happening in the market? Do we see people taking those initiatives to include those types of metrics in their systems and protocols?
Not much. I mean, I'd like to say yes. And I think if there's anyone out there listening who has case studies, we're actually looking for case studies for companies who are really measuring well-being in a way that correlates to to actual well-being. When I started my career at Intuit, and it was at QuickBooks, and they did something that was not good, and they actually did something that was pretty good. So the thing that was not good was that they were measuring. I had two metrics of success while I was early in my career as a PM. One was logins. And this was absolutely the wrong thing to measure me on. I was a PM of an accounting software. Nobody who is using QuickBooks should want to use the product any more than they have to. If anything, my measures of success should have been how infrequently I have to log in order to maintain my business in accounting, right? As soon as you start measuring a PM, marketer, or designer on something like logins, you're going to increase the usage of the product. And so that, and typically this is what we put up on the Excel sheet or we send around as a dashboard is active use, and this is just login. So I think very clearly companies should move from a measure of logins or engagement and active use to something that better correlates with what they're actually trying to do. Now, the good thing that Intuit did is they moved then, and this was not just me, this was a company move, to measuring saving of time. And so over time, PMs now have to track, if they're going to launch a new feature, they have to track how much time it saves from the prior feature. And they have to show basically that this is actually going to improve somebody's time and have people spend less time in the product. And something like that is actually very easy to measure. Time in a product and how little time you spend in the product is an easy measurable KPI. Now, it's just not transferable to many businesses that base their revenue off of ads, because more time in the product will mean more revenue. And so there's some conflict of interest and incentives for companies that have an ad-based model to really design for time well spent.
Yeah, and to me, that's the thorniest issue with big tech, is that these products aren't neutral. There's shareholder value that has to be answered to. There's this, Tristan Harris, I think he's a Google design or former Google design ethicist, talks a lot about this. And so these incentives aren't aligned. And I just, as you said, if it's ad based, how do you even begin that change? How do you present that overhaul to shareholders? It seems like we're just too far into it at this point.
I think so. I mean, for companies that are not, and many are not ad supported, at least, they use ads, but they're not ad supported. I think an easier switch for companies is to focus on a behavior. So if we just think about kind of behavioral economics, the main thing is behavior change. And most times when we're working on a behavior change product with companies, they don't agree on what behavior they want to change. So if you interview people that, from the marketing to the design to the exec to the manager, and ask them what behavior are we trying to change, they'll all give us different answers. Not only that, the answers are very broad and usually outcome focused. And so it's very difficult to change behavior if the company is not aligned on it, or if the actual behavior that they're trying to change is something broad, like we want people to eat healthy. It's like, well, what does eating healthy mean? Or we want them to do an action. Right. Well, like, what action do you want them to do? And so I think the easier way to kind of move into the world of like, how do we instead of, just driving for profit and revenue and engagement, we focus on the behavior and then get really good at trying to figure out what behavior we want someone to do. And then it becomes much harder for, I think, folks to, say, because then you'd have a PM saying, like, I want them to click on an ad. And like, I don't think actually these companies really, I think they're pretending much more than that. They say, I want them to have a good time in the product. And by the way, if they click on an ad, this is very nice and it helps support our business. So by doing that, we kind of refocus people on the mission and vision of the company as well.
And so this focus on the behavior, and in my mind is like, okay, now enter in behavioral scientist or behavioral designer, which I want to talk about in a second, that distinction. Because it seems like that's a skill that folks I know in the field take for granted, which is the ability to see something as an action or a behavior and to sort of draw lines around it and call it what it is, define it, operationalize it, and then track it and measure it. that's something that I think a non-behavioral scientist or somebody who doesn't have that background that wouldn't necessarily come natural to them.
Yeah, totally.
Do you agree with that? Do you think we need more of us in there for that purpose, or at least for that one purpose?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think we find that we spend the most times with teams trying to get them to agree on what behavior they're working to change. And obviously this is a hypothesis because the behavior still may be wrong. And so you go about this looking like I'm going to try to design a feature, product, experience such that this behavior is going to change. And maybe that actually doesn't correlate to, to users that love the product or that get value out of it. But you have to make some hypothesis. And this is very difficult for teams for a variety of reasons. One, we call it, we have to get uncomfortably specific with the key behavior that we're looking to change. And anytime you get specific, people will, argue. And there's some conflict in declaring this is what we're going to do. So we don't know if people are inherently bad at it. It's just companies getting this specific have to kind of make some declaration, which is difficult for somebody to go on a limb and do. And it's usually just not the language folks have. So we hear things like, we want them to get value out of the product. Which is wonderful. It just isn't a behavior, right? Or we want them to, come back, which shows that they enjoy using the product. This is fine. This is just not really a behavior that they would do with your product. And so when we think about behaviors, if it was, we get really specific, like if it's an education app, we want them to study 2 times a week in the morning in between lectures. Right. And it doesn't even have to be within the product. But when we say we want them to study 2 times in the week, in the morning, in between lectures, we've declared a few things that will make designing a feature much easier. We've declared it's 2 times. We've declared it's in the morning. We've declared it's in between lectures. And now all of a sudden, it becomes very easy to design a feature against this, right? Reminders become obvious. Reminders timed with this become obvious. Having implementation intentions, social proof, accountability, all these things, how you'd implement them are fairly obvious as soon as you get to the behavior that you're trying to drive.
Great. So now we have at some level in an organization, and let's just keep it to startups, just because I find it's a fascinating space. So like, a tech product startup, let's say, and they're in Silicon Valley. Are you of the mindset that every startup like these should have a behavioral science person as a founding team member? Like, because it used to be like a person with the idea would come, to a VC meeting, and they're the single founder, and the VC says, I'm on board, except you need to get a co-founder who's your CTO. Like you needed that CTO to round out the team. Do you think the CBO is that next position to come in the mix? And if not, at what stage do you think it makes sense to bring somebody in the mix?
I don't know how behavioral science will infiltrate companies. I've been thinking about this for a while and a little stumped. But I think a behavior change person or expert behavioral scientist, I think, is helpful for companies looking to change behavior. So I just want to make that I don't think back-end infrastructure or even B2B companies, it's as critical as if it's a to consumer-based offering, and specifically on something that assumes, and startups kind of inherently have this, but assumes that people have to do something different in order to interact or get value out of your product. So I think it's very important in those ways, and likely in the earlier the better. So, when companies call us and they ask us to help them do this behavior change, we basically get sometimes people sloppy seconds. They already have a product. I mean, we're just trying to kind of, what we say, put lipstick on a pig, of like maybe make it a little bit better, work for the consumer, but really kind of the essence of behavior change is building the product from the ground up. If you're thinking about trying to build like a financial app for families, we really have to understand things like reciprocity and things like accountability and things like kind of like a growth mindset in order to build that into the core, the core of the product, and adding that on later is difficult. So I would say yes, early on, yes, for the right companies. And then I think it's just a general question of what does HR, what will they stand for? So, a new position, we've talked to a few HR managers to ask them this question of, is it better for us to be promoting people to be behavioral product managers or a behavioral designer? Or is it better for us to be promoting, one role as a chief behavioral scientist or a behavioral scientist? And the HR managers are of the mind it's much harder to get a new role as a standard hiring practice than it is to change a few qualifications of a hire. And so if we think about the path of least resistance, and we take that, then it looks like more the behavioral product manager and the behavioral designer, would flourish more. I think this leaves a lot on the table because currently we don't have training. We do some we do a boot camp. Other people do some things. We don't have a lot of societal training for this to happen. So I'd be nervous at scale calling people behavioral product managers without an actual training. So I think in my ideal world, I'd love it to have a chief behavioral scientist and a behavioral science team that actually is kind of a combination of the research team and the PM team. But I just don't know how feasible that is from where we stand right now.
And this is a topic that has come up many times already, and this is only the fifth episode of recording. And that question is, a question of talent and how do you train these people and what do we call them? And if we have a dedicated team, what is the mix of that team? Are like sort of a third of them quant heavy and have that typical postgraduate training, whereas the other third are more qualitative, perhaps they have a sociology or an anthropology background, and then the other third are maybe data analytics is one mix that I've heard. I've heard different mixes as well at the same time. It gets at this point, which I think we're still, as you alluded to, we're still scratching our head over and wondering, how do we best do it? And you have this wonderful piece on Medium. I think I saw it, which walks through how do you do behavioral design work, or how do you I think it's how to get into behavioral economics, without giving too much away, because I think it's a great piece. And I know you do mention like the boot camp. Can you talk a bit about that and the rationale behind that? And also, I'm with respect to that, it seems we've pivoted in our language from behavioral economics to behavioral design. And why do you think that's the case? And is it working?
I like the pivot to behavioral design. I think behavioral economics is too intimidating for a company. A company doesn't think that they need a behavioral economist, but they do understand that they need a behavioral designer, especially if they're in the to consumer products. So I think that pivot is correct. I'm kind of the mind, kind of just going back to this idea of like, what are the skill sets that a behavioral scientist needs? I'm kind of in the mindset that we should basically separate out someone who's a data scientist from somebody who's who could do behavioral science and understand human psychology. And here's why. I think early on and still a little bit, if you are a PM, you have to know computer science, which means you have to be able to code. And I think that kind of like pushed tech into a world where that was prioritizing the technical qualifications to be a PM over the customer qualifications, the psychology qualifications. And so you have all these very highly skilled technical PMs who are actually probably just better people or understand a little bit more, but they are missing a core psychology. And so you have then products that lead with technology, not with customers. I fear that if behavioral science goes this way, where we overemphasize the need for data science in our field as one of the top qualifications, that we may underestimate the need for the psychology element of this, because as kind of data science, the field is becoming more complex, and the tools needed to be a successful data scientist are, these people are incredible. They need to know, they need to be up to date on all the stats, all the R, Python, et cetera. I mean, I think this is a skill set that takes a life devotion, or at least at many companies it does. It's a lot to be a very good data scientist. So I don't really want behavioral scientists to have like half-assed data science and half-assed psychology. And so that's my worry about splitting the two, is that you're always then going to need a partner in crime on the data science team to help you, and then you're always not going to be devoting enough effort or time or research capacity. The other good news, though, is behavioral science is kind of a simple simpler data field, right? We do RCTs, we do A/B testing. This is not big data. This is not taking a big data set and trying to understand correlations or building an AI model. Now it could be, but at the core, it's not. And so I'd more emphasize the psychology with like some data science background and enough to do, basic analysis on RCTs.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The types of interventions we're running with these RCTs or A/B testing doesn't require a whole lot of, statistical know-how. A basic level, I think, is necessary. But then it also makes me wonder that as our field progresses and as we begin to address more difficult questions, we start to consider, more interactive or sort of like these big, messy, multifactorial problems. And once, obviously, once we start to roll in multiple factors and multiple variables, then your statistical modeling just has to become more complex, and the people who are doing it have to be savvy in that. And I ran into this as a graduate student, and I using SPSS for years was so against learning R just because that's not in my wheelhouse, and Python. I pushed them away for as long as I could, because I knew there was just somebody else who would probably do it. So is it the case then that, okay, let's assume then that we do get into more complex problems, even with RCTs and these interventions, do we keep the psychology and the behavioral science training strong and just pull in under that umbrella of a behavioral change team or behavioral change unit, whatever you want to call it again, these folks who are more technically trained?
I think so. And I don't want to undermine that. I think a behavioral scientist should be able to design an RCT and design testing. I mean, this is the kind of the meat of behavioral science is understanding kind of how to test an assumption, and what is an assumption. So I don't want to, but yeah, I think that the way that the field is going is that we will always need a partner. We were just trying to figure out a mixed method sample size, and just had to pull in a stats partner from Duke to ensure that we were doing it correct. And she didn't even know. And so it was like, wow, this is, the complex data that's coming out of apps right now is a lot. There's time series data there's just a lot going on. And I think Uber is actually championing, or I went to the BEX thing, they're championing some of this, saying it's actually not as intuitive to be able to correctly analyze data given the complexity of the things that the apps are doing. So I wouldn't underestimate this. I think behavioral science shouldn't, we think about this a lot when we're trying to just put a job rec out there, is what are the qualifications needed, and would more prioritize somebody who has a deep psychology understanding and has executed field experiments, than somebody who is an expert statistician. Right.
Mm-hmm. And I pulled you off track. So going back to that piece, which relates to all this, let's say that the person who's reading this, and perhaps the person who's listening in right now, they don't have a PhD, they don't have an interest in doing a PhD, and yet they still want to get
it's tough. So I think that there's a lot of ways to do it, and I think some is just hard work, which is trying to figure out if there's a program that meets your current job requirement. So that's why we do our boot camp, is so that people can continue on with their current job and learn behavioral science while also offering value to their company. The second option is to just take a pause and do it, a 2-year master's program. There's a few popping up that are reputable, and I think that's a really good option for somebody who is able to commit that time. And then the third is to look around and see kind of how you could become a behavioral scientist in your own job. And that means trying to think like one and saying, like, what experiments or tests could I run? Do I really trust the qualitative research that our team is doing? How would I get more confidence in the next feature that we launch? What experiments could I run? And sometimes this could be creative, where you say you don't need to actually run an in-product experiment. We use Qualtrics to do A/B testing and studies within a survey-based tool, or it could be partnering up with a nearby professor and asking them to run a field experiment. I think running experiments is probably one of the top things to get exposure and experience while not working in the field. That is what we mostly look at when we're hiring, is saying, have people thought like a behavioral scientist before, created a hypothesis based on some psychology, and then was able to test it.
And now here I am. I have this pang of cognitive dissonance. And this is just an exercise in effort justification, because I spent half a decade in doing a master's and a PhD, and then here I am now. I find myself doing applied, or more of a behavioral science practitioner outside of your traditional academia and research. So what I'm wrestling with now is if I could go back in time, or give advice to somebody who's in a similar position just outside of undergrad and is considering, do they need to do that PhD? And did I need to do that PhD and waste all that time and money? I don't know. And then so then I go back, and this is the effort justification part, is I tell myself, well, yes, of course I had to, because there's such a wealth of literature out there, and the theories are so nuanced, coming from social and cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, all of the related fields, that it helps to have some people, not all, but some people who have a good grasp of that.
I think now, please
tell me if I'm completely
deep expertise
wrong,
is always
and if
very
I
nice.
feel
And
bad
so
about
I don't
doing
think you should feel bad. I think deep expertise is always wonderful. The thing I would be concerned about for people taking a PhD track is the assumption that they can get out of it.
Thank you.
And so, typically at these very nice schools, you're just not going to be able to apply for your PhD with a publicized intent to leave it and return to industry. That's just not how the world works in the PhD world right now. And so it'd be very difficult to say, I want to get a PhD such that I can leave and have someone accept you. That'd be a main concern. And then the other concern is just signaling, that people who go into a PhD have signaled that they are on the academic track. And so a company looking at somebody with a PhD just coming out with no work experience or little work experience, it would be concerning to a hiring manager. And so, because they're looking at the same signaling that the PhD, that your professor who brings you on would be looking at, is that they think you've decided you're an academic type. So I don't think going to get a PhD is inherently something you should or shouldn't do. It's just that the setup around it doesn't make it easy if you want to go back into industry.
Totally agree. And that was absolutely my experience. And this is way back before the so-called behavioral revolution took off. And it was, not only was it not encouraged, it was actually frowned upon to even consider leaving, your typical traditional academia research tenure path. But that's changing. So the more I think about it and hearing what you're saying, is I would almost treat it as a lot of MBA students treat it, where they finish an undergrad in whatever. Let's assume there's some level of psychology or behavioral science in there as a major or minor. They go off into the world of work, and they are confirmed. It's confirmed for them that they want to do this type of work. And then they get into a terminal master's program that is a year or 2 years. And you said there's some really good ones popping up in some really great institutions, where the sole purpose is to train that person to become a practitioner, to go out back into industry. I think that is just that is a much shorter path.
Yeah, and I think now is the time to do it, because there's very few people who are on the market with these qualifications. And so I would say if you're going to be very desirable to graduate from one of these programs in the next few years, I think, with a very desirable skill set, especially if you take on projects during, you take on applied projects during the master's.
And it makes me wonder, there's data that I read that came out a couple months ago, showing that the application rates to the big MBA programs in the US, primarily sort of your Stanford and Harvard and whatnot, were the lowest they've ever been. It was the biggest drop, the biggest reduction in not admission, but in application rates. I wonder if we're going to see and they sort of explain why that's the case, but I wonder if we'll see a similar drop in PhD, because for so long there was these students who were like, oh, I did an undergrad. Well, now I'm going to do a master's. Well, now I'm going to do a PhD, and not really having a set plan. So I think because before there wasn't this as an option. Now that there is, now that there are these alternatives that they can do that make much more sense, that are more feasible, much more pragmatic, I think my hypothesis, my intuition is that we're going to see a significant drop in admissions and applications to PhD programs. And they need that, because not everyone's actually, some people should be an academic, like a true academic. But there's a mismatch between the amount of people who go in and the amount of people who leave. So I think this makes total sense. So thank you for confirming that. There was, I guess, before I get to this question, a couple more questions for you. You announced, this is piggybacking off of this topic. You sort of have this really interesting path to what you're doing now. Can you give a little bit of insight? And you were like one of the first. Can you explain what your decisions were? What inspired you? Was it a straight and narrow?
I don't know. I mean, I think
and all over the place.
I think I was like a mix of hard work and luck. So I was at QuickBooks, at Intuit, had a variety of positions, with Quicken and QuickBooks. Met Dan Ariely kind of early in my career, and just really at the time where I was leading this customer development stuff, which is like we'd bring people in, we'd ask them why they do things, and we'd ask them to tell us about the features they want to build, and then I as a PM would go and try to build those features, and really just didn't have any correlation between the things that people were saying they were going to do and the actual behaviors after we built the features. And it's quite depressing. And then Dan Ariely comes in, and basically it was around 2007 when he had launched, 2008 when he had launched his first book. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is it, right? There's a science to behavior. And here I am as a PM, I was trying to kind of learn as I go. It was a slow route is what I thought. I was like, this is behavioral science, has all of these resources from all of these papers that have already been published. And why am I trying to recreate the wheel? That's just kind of hilarious in some world that a PM at any level is not reading lots of papers before they start development on a new feature. I mean, I studied marketing and economics, which if you were to put those together in hindsight would be one, but I didn't. The field was really kind of just beginning to popularize, so I didn't transparently have a conception of, other than understanding psychology, understanding economics, a conception of what the behavioral science field was or could be. And I think that's, to Dan's credit, what he really did for most of us was kind of create a language around human irrationality such that we could talk about it in potentially non-academic language. And so I think, I got lucky in the fact of Dan and I tried to figure out a collaboration within Intuit where I would kind of design features and products, using kind of Intuit resources while he would help. And that never worked out. I ended up quitting Intuit, but working with Dan on the side of I went to a tech startup for 2 to 3, probably actually over 3 years of just doing side projects with him, one of which was StartupOnomics, but other side projects, and really just learned a lot from him along that journey. And never really considered that this would be a career path for me, because I wasn't going to get a PhD. I was kind of committed to the industry world and didn't want to invest in the PhD a lot because I knew I wasn't going to be on the academic track. So really wasn't transparently considering how I could actually operationalize this within my own career until Dan was hired by Google to start their behavioral science kind of unit and brought me on And that was wonderful. It was Google is a wonderful place. And they were very generous to us. We worked with like 25 teams over 3 years to do experiments. And there's not many places in the world that can do that many experiments, and with the amount of people, or like the amount of sample size. And so really, really high learning curve. And I think especially in that time when field experiments weren't as popular, I think what we were doing was actually quite novel, of bringing that kind of that psychology insights to a product team, isolating the actual insight, and then running an experiment to test if we were right or wrong. And so, yeah, I think I got a mix of lucky and hard work to basically just kind of working on the side on something I was really interested in. And I think that's just generally a good idea for people, is to pursue side projects that are interest based, and not worry too much if there's a there, and just kind of double click if you're interested and passionate about it. Or in hindsight, that's my rationalization. Yeah.
It's a good one. And like I know you probably said this, but just to hammer down, like again, you said, was it that time when Dan came in, or just prior to, when you were trying to sort of workshop these ideas, that the behavior part stood out to you? Was there sort of a defining moment?
I think
like this,
the insights
clouds
that Dan
parted,
was
sun comes from the
bringing were
sky,
not
that sort of angels
revolutionary
come from
at this point. But I think to any PM or designer, when you can talk about someone's product so knowledgeably without actually having talked to any customers, it was like, oh my gosh, he's like speaking to us as if he knows all the things we've just been through trying to get people to adopt certain behaviors. For me particularly, I was once at Quicken Online. This was a product before Mint, or Intuit bought Mint, and I was a product team that was competing with Mint. And we brought people into the lab after having spent a lot of time trying to design a feature for them. The feature was like a pie chart that showed all their money together, kind of like Mint has now. And I just remember the team kind of like evaluating and looking at people as they would like load up there. Intuit had a really cool kind of UX UI lab, and so you could watch people as they used your product for the first time, and people would just, as soon as they saw their money visualized in this pie graph, would just cover their eyes. And we were just like, oh my gosh, we thought the product was so beautiful. We thought that we had really like designed something that people would love. What is going on? And as a PM, we in design team, we didn't know. We had to like kind of test and learn, and then like continue to see people cover their eyes. And then as a behavioral scientist, of course, you know what's going on, right? This is information aversion. This is loss aversion. Information aversion just being we don't actually want to see what's in front of us, and which explains a little bit of the lack of engagement and retention for personal financial management software. As people use it once and then they don't continue to budget and they don't continue to come back. And loss aversion just being you're actually really just visualizing the amount of money that people are losing every month in a way that they can't get away from. And so, if we had understood kind of human irrationalities and human biases, in no world would we have designed that feature. And all of this is pretty obvious in hindsight, but before meeting and basically meeting the field of behavioral science, it's something you have to discover the long way. Most PMs and designers understand these human biases, but they just take a little bit longer to do it.
Right. That's my mentality, is that we're not geniuses who have like sort of come out of nowhere, who've just appeared for coming down from our ivory tower of academia. It's like there's been an entire field of
for sure
folk or lay psychologists and product teams and marketing and sales, and they've been doing this work for decades, as long as capitalism has been capitalism. I think we just bring a little bit more rigor to the game, and theory and definitions, and of course the bread and butter being experimental testing. But even that was sort of a premise that was.
I would say I think there's something kind of non-intuitive sometimes about behavioral science that is actually hard to get to from a linear path.
Yeah,
and so we worked with a really nice nonprofit that was trying to help. Actually, they were a startup, but like half of them were a nonprofit. They were trying to get folks to apply to companies like Staples and a little bit of a kind of entry-level position. And the reality is that they were getting people to do kind of the pre-work, and then they'd have to get them to show up to a job interview. And we asked this founder to say, can you just put a deadline on some of the steps so that more people complete them? And she was like, this is crazy. Why would I put a deadline on these things? I would be taking away the service from people, because if they miss the deadline, then they can't, or they think they can't use my product and service. And we're here to serve people. And I just don't want to take away the product or service for people. And yet what we know, and many people do know who understand deadlines, is that this can actually get more people to take action versus less. But kind of in the mindset that, you're doing something, we call it sometimes doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. You're doing something, you want someone to apply to the job, but they're doing it for the wrong reasons, which is a deadline. Sometimes figuring out those wrong reasons is not intuitive, at least to the people who are kind of designing behavioral science or designing product changes for good.
And I think that's the crux of it, is that a lot of the insights from behavioral science or social psychology and related fields is that humans don't act in accordance with, sort of rational models, or as you would expect, or as somebody might intuit. And it's it's the counterintuitiveness of our behavior, which, makes us quirky and emotional and selfish and all these amazing things that we probably take for granted and that aren't so just.
Go for it. Actually, I do have time, and but I'll make my answer shorter.
Okay, 2 more questions if you don't mind, if you have time for them. Okay. Okay. If you want to elaborate, you can elaborate. So I'm just curious because I came across another piece you wrote, and this was a very short one on mindfulness. I think it's a few years old, or at least a couple years old. And please feel free to fact check or correct me if I get anything wrong. But the reason this stands out to me is because I'm very much into mindfulness and the translation of the science of mindfulness into practice. And it's some client work that I do, and I'm just really sort of into it right now, both on the pros and cons and all sides. So I believe you have this piece that's called Thoughts About Thoughts. And if can I read an excerpt from that if you don't mind? This is great. She basically puts herself undercover. I think the she being a thought here. So she basically put herself undercover. She dresses up like consciousness and is prancing around, owning the place, cleaning house. Every thought she notices almost immediately dies. A bloodbath of thoughts, all lying on the floor, stabbed in the back by one of their own. So my question is,
so I think a few things.
What's your experience with mindfulness?
I'm a big fan of Sam Harris's Waking Up meditation courses, and he really says it pretty nicely of just, we're really, in behavioral sciences, we think that we're making these decisions frequently and based on heuristics, and really mindfulness is getting us to pause, reflect, and make a kind of decide how we want to show up, whether that be kind of clearing your mind, or whether that be making a decision, or just not letting basically the thoughts kind of rule you, if you will. So I think this idea of basically pausing and reflecting and getting your mind to quiet is obviously good. I worry about how it can be brought to the masses. I think the way it's being taught and talked about now is not something that the masses of people can do, and I'm hopeful that kind of as the language more develops and people prophesize it more, that it could become more of a norm, especially with mindfulness classes starting in school. But I I'm skeptical. I mean, it has everything going against it, right? You basically sit down for a period of time. So you have to do this as a habit. It's saying you only get benefits if you do it on a regular basis. We know that habits are very hard to form, and there's no immediate benefits. You can feel good about yourself. So I think if we're to change mindfulness at all, it would be actually to amp up how good people feel. I'm a good person because I meditate, not because I actually feel better, but they actually get some pride and status from it. So I would, meditation gets made fun of for that, but I think that's one of the few reasons people do it is they get to tell people that they have meditated. So, so I think we need to get more creative with how we promote this kind of versus just thinking that people can kind of start a habit on a regular basis with no obvious immediate benefits. This is very not doesn't follow the behavioral science framework at all.
Yeah, and yeah, I just I think your line there. I think that should be like copy that sits on the landing page of like Headspace or Calm or something like that. But it is true though that even the science of mindfulness, these mindfulness researchers themselves and others are becoming more critical because for decades, 1 or 2, 10, 20 years, it was just positive result after positive result. I think it's basically mindfulness is going to solve everything, any problem we can think of. In our psychology, mindfulness will take care of it, which is, that in itself should just be a red flag. So now, for instance, there's studies that are coming out recent that are saying, if you compare, the question is mindfulness compared to other things which we know reduce stress, which we know help with emotion regulation, etc. Is mindfulness per se adding incremental benefit above and beyond these other things? And so far the jury's out. Like there's one study where it shows if you practice for the same amount of time exercising, you get the exact same benefits, no difference between that and mindfulness practice for the matching on the amount of time. Exercising for a lot of people is much more fun and enjoyable than sitting on a cushion trying to wrestle your thoughts.
Incredible though. I mean, tango dancing is I've not done it, but apparently is incredible, right? The amount of high that you get from this dance. People are just addicted to tango dancing in a way that is pretty incredible. And so, man, if meditation can match tango dancing, that's incredible. I know it. I don't think you've talked to people who are really into tango dancing.
Okay, I was thinking about it the other way, but I. You're right. I know absolutely nothing. So maybe then to your point,
should be our measure
speaks
for
to the
success for many things. Can you match tango
mindfulness
dancing?
if it's delivering an equally high impact as tango dancing. Yeah, that's our benchmark. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so final question is what I ask everyone: the BBB, or the big behavioral brainstorm. So of all the things that are going on in modern society for us humans, where do you see behavioral insights or the work of behavioral design coming
it's a great question. I'll share. I don't know if I can answer kind of holistically societal based. This takes probably more of a evaluation of impact, et cetera. But I think for me personally right now, I'm really excited about the potential for behavioral science to help people with connection and making friends and keeping friends. I think, it's been framed kind of in society saying we have a social isolation and loneliness problem, but I think we actually have a connection problem. And most of if we think about the core hypothesis of behavioral science, it's that the environment has an outsized influence on our behavior. So it's not that people don't want to make friends and have deep connections, but our environments are not designed to make that conducive. So if we look at bars, right, you go into a bar and the music is loud, it's dark, it's just focused on alcohol. You're coming with your friend. There's really no bar that is systematically tried to help people become friends or even become more than friends. They really just serve alcohol. So bars are kind of failing us. Homes right? You buy a home. This is away from you're typically kind of buying something that is not close to your friends. You're moving away from your social support network typically in order to own a home. And we're prioritizing countertops over relationships. And so those two, and then work is not designed to help us connect with other people, even though this is a majority of the time that we spend during our day. And so we basically have, the home that's not helpful is isolating us, a work environment that's not conducive, and then, our entertainment are kind of the core thing that many people do on the weekends is just not facilitating connection. So I think a massive opportunity is changing how the infrastructure of our society enables people to develop relationships and maintain them. I mean, I think a lot of this is the mental health kind of crisis that we're facing is a lot of people don't have support systems. They feel alone, and rightfully so, because they're not having day-to-day contact with people who care about them. And so behavioral science in general is good at hacking environments, and I have a lot of hope that a spotlight is being put on this right now and we have a lot of ideas we're exploring, but like in general, I think the field is getting more excited about the concept as well, and movement will make some movement here.
That's fantastic. It's a noble and a worthy cause, and I haven't read much about it myself, to be completely honest, and I actually am very intrigued by this. So I will be keeping my eyes peeled for anything that comes out. I agree. I think it is sort of the root cause variable that would make a lot of things change.
We're doing we're putting out conversational cards,
this piece of human
that kind of will grease the wheel of the conversation to dive a little bit deeper. So we think kind of left to our own devices, it's very easy to talk about small talk, which doesn't facilitate a relationship. And so we've created some cards that basically people can use to kind of bring out when they're in a social environment. And you can blame the cards instead of saying, I just like to know about a childhood memory that made you upset. Sometimes not, right? But you can now blame the scientifically driven cards. So,
so it's not like the person's weird. I was actually not long ago. I was in a client meeting of all things, and they brought one of these out, this little box with cards, and we ended the meeting that way. When at first I was completely caught off guard because it's not what you typically do, but it made perfect sense that they were doing it. It was lovely. And then it spurred like further conversation that was completely unrelated to the work we were doing and just much more personal and
exactly.
And established this connection. So I've actually seen those, and I think they're really cool. And we need more of those. Less alcohol at bars, more of these cards. Should do that. Excellent. Well, we are just under an hour.
Great.
Time flies.
Thank you.
This was fantastic. So thank you again so much. I think listeners are going to get a lot out of this conversation. So Kristen, thanks for your time.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.